Hi everyone, welcome to Textual Criticism Part 2, an introduction to the methodology. So much of the information that you're going to see today, and again this is introductory material, so for all of you professional text critics out there, just forgive what I'm doing here. This is just to give a basic introduction. You can turn to Emmanuel Tove in his Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, which is in its third edition now in 2011. At least that's the last one that I saw. But a lot of good information obviously in there, and many other resources that you can utilize to look at textual criticism and how we get to the original reading. So what we're going to talk about today is what textual criticism is. As you remember, yesterday we looked at how we got to the place where we needed to do textual criticism. So having the variety of manuscripts with the variety of variants, the many different variants, and how do we figure out what the or text is, the original text? What was the autograph? What was there? Because we don't have it anymore. So what is textual criticism? What are the rules, quote unquote, and the problems that are associated with them? And then we'll sort of tie it all together with a conclusion. So let's take a look. What is textual criticism? Well, there are many different definitions that you can find, but basically it's the process by which we attempt to reconstruct a text that is as close to the original as possible. So, yesterday, if you remember the daily data, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go back and take a look. I think it's actually pretty neat. Go figure that I would say that. When we looked at that exercise yesterday, we had the original. I wrote the original letter, and then we had all the manuscripts, all the copies. That's not the case for the biblical text. What we have are all the copies with no autograph. So we have to reconstruct. We have to figure out what the original said. And this is, not always an easy process. But it's one that we want to try to have some guidelines, some quote-unquote rules that we utilize. And, of course, not all textual criticism is the same. If you're looking at, for example, Sumerian textual criticism, you have a very different, not very different, but a different set of objectives and tools that you're utilizing, so it's not going to look the same. But here, that's what we're focusing on. Here is the biblical text and how we get back to the autograph as much as possible. So, what methodologies can we use? Well, the main methodology is pretty simple. We want to collect all the variants, so get all the manuscripts together, like I did in that example yesterday. Get all the manuscripts together and collect all the variants, and then look at all those variants, evaluate them, and see if we can figure out what the original reading would have been. So, I want to make it clear that I'm introducing these things. This is in no way completely agreed upon. It's not like there's a rule book that people have. Many people write on textual criticism, but I feel like I'm going to, in broad strokes, talk about some of the main ideas when it comes to textual criticism. So, the majority reading equals the original. So, this is one approach that you can take. If you have 10 manuscripts and 8 of them say he walked and only 2 of them say he ran, you might say, well, 8 of them have he walked, and so that means that the original must have been he walked, not he ran. Well, that's not necessarily the case. I'm sure that obviously oftentimes that is the case. I don't even want to say often, just I'm sure that there are many times that is the case. But this method can often fail. For example, versions will often rely on one another, and so you might have different witnesses that are saying the same thing, that have the same variant, the same reading, but as it turns out, they borrowed from one another. They relied on one another, and so one of them could have had a faulty reading that was then borrowed by the rest. So you can't just broadly or universally apply this majority reading equals the original rule or methodology. So there have been, again, rules that have been developed that are text critical rules, and so I say they're in biblical textual criticism. Other guidelines are necessary. So these are some of the quote-unquote rules that have been developed. Rule number 1, the more difficult reading is preferred. So if a scribe encountered a difficult reading, for example, a word that was odd to him or seemed out of place, for example, in our text yesterday, the phrase "cats and frogs," it's raining cats and frogs. A scribe might come to that, if that was the original reading, and say, "Whoa, cats and frogs, that's not what it's, cats and dogs." And so he might correct that to cats and dogs. Well, if you had 3 manuscripts that had cats and dogs and 1 manuscript that had cats and frogs, you might say, well, now it makes more sense that it should be cats and dogs. But that might simply be the result of a scribe coming to the phrase cats and frogs, which was the original, and saying, "This, I don't understand this, it doesn't make sense. I'm going to correct it to something easier, something that makes more sense." So scribal errors, so that's one problem that you might have, right? Or that's the idea behind this. The more difficult reading might be the correct reading, and oftentimes is. However, you can't universally apply that, because scribal errors themselves could also create a more difficult reading. So, if you for example, in that same, I guess I can just keep going back to my example. In one of the lines, I say, I spell the word "and" A-N-G. Well, that's a more difficult reading than A-N-D, and. And of course, that's not a good example, because in that example, that is the original reading. But if a scribe were to accidentally write A-N-G instead of A-N-D, anticipating the G of the next word, for example, that would be a scribal error that would create a more difficult reading. We can't necessarily go with the more difficult reading. So it's a good rule, quote unquote, to go with the more difficult reading, but you can't universally apply that. Rule number 2, the shorter reading is preferable. So scribes tended to expand text, for example, making things more explicit, adding glosses. So, if they thought it was unclear what the subject of a sentence was, they might mark it in such a way, expand it in such a way to make sure that you understood that it was the subject or that it was the object. Or if there was a gloss that you could add to make sure that the person understood what word you were talking about specifically, they might do that. So then that longer reading, that expanded reading, that gloss, that was put on there, would represent a later correction, or a later addition to the text. And so the shorter reading would be preferable. But you can't universally apply this, because it can be difficult to know if there were accidental deletions, right? So you can't just go to a text and say, well, this one is shorter, this one's longer, therefore the shorter one works, because it's not always the case. Rule number 3, and there are others, but I'll stick with these 3 because they're pretty popular, and I think kind of lay out the points well. Interpretive changes that were applied to the text. So there are some difficult passages, and those were changed to align with more more common or applicable theological interpretive views of the scribe. And so if there was something there that it had a theological difficulty for the scribe, or an interpretive problem when he was thinking about another text, he might make a small change so that text would align with his theological interpretive view. Well, the problem is, you can't always know which ones are interpretive changes, right? So you can't just say, oh, well, this looks like an interpretive change, so we have to go with the other one. It can be very difficult to know if such a change is interpretive, or if it is a change, right? If a text represents an interpretive change, it may actually be what was originally written. So it's subjective on the part of the text critic. So we can't just universally apply this one as well. So what can we conclude here, right? And I think it's clear, and I'm trying to keep this short, but I think it's clear just from the way I'm describing these things. These rules can be good, right? And they are good, and they're things that you want to keep in mind. So I say they should be considered guidelines or tools in your toolkit rather than hard and fast rules, which is of course why I put them in quotation marks. But these are tools or guidelines that the textual critic can use to identify original readings or original reading in a text. But you can't universally apply these things in a way that fits all situations. So you don't, for example, as a text critic, want to come now, armed with some of these rules. You don't want to go to, for example, Romans 5:1 and say, well, let us have peace, and we have peace. Well, we know which one because of rule number 2. We know which one it is. That would be that would just be a too simplistic and not a sophisticated enough approach to the passage. You have to the variant. You have to make sure as a text critic that you're using these tools, these guidelines, but you're using them in a way that takes into account all of the other things that are going on in the text. So tomorrow. So yesterday I showed you an example of how we get to where we are with the biblical text. Today I showed you some of the rules or guidelines that you can use in textual criticism and that are used in textual criticism. Tomorrow I'm going to actually show you, not going into tremendous amounts of detail, but how this sort of plays out and what you're looking at when you look into the Hebrew Bible. So textual criticism in the Hebrew Bible, an inside look. I'm actually going to show you, pictures of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, BHS. Of course, I'll talk about other resources that are used or other editions that are used, but BHS was the one I cut my teeth on. BHQ exists now. I know that, everybody, but I think it's still easier to use BHS. But that was way too much detail. Sorry, everybody, just ignore the last 15 seconds. I'll show you tomorrow what it looks like actually on the page and how we can practically go through and utilize a critical text edition so that you too can start to see what people mean when they say, oh, well, that word actually is different in the Septuagint, or that word is different in the Masoretic text, or that word blah, blah, blah. You can see how it is that they're identifying those things. Okay, I'll see you guys tomorrow.